A loving family in a quiet town, and a crime so brutal even detectives were shaken. In 1987, the Dardeen family were found slaughtered in their own home. But what is their story and what happened? Welcome back and welcome to Just Another Mystery, where we talk about true crime, cold cases, mysteries, and cults. So if that sounds like your jam, make sure you subscribe. Quick disclaimer that we will be discussing scenes of a violent nature and viewer discretion is advised. So let's start off with who are the Dardeens? Well, Keith Dardeen was 29 and he was married to Elaine Dardeen, who was 30. They had 2 children, well, 1.5 really. Their son, named Peter, was 3 years old, and they had another child on the way. Elaine was pregnant, and they were super excited for their new child. Now, both of the Dardeens were very involved in the community, and Keith did a lot of work for the church. They both lived on a little trailer just outside of Ena in Illinois. Now, this is a really small town where everyone really knows each other, and it's one of those towns that you can imagine that you see on TV where everyone's really friendly, and everyone goes to church and they all really, support each other. They were a very well-liked family, and Keith was known as being very hardworking and responsible, and Elaine was a stay-at-home mum, and everyone thought that she was such a good mum. You can imagine they were just living a quiet life, but a really lovely, family-friendly one. Whilst they were going to church often, they saw that Ena, Illinois, started to change a little bit, and so did the area that they lived in. They found that a lot more people were moving in, and with a lot of people moving into an area, before the services can keep up, there is often a lot of crime, and the crime was increasing around them. Keith did note that he was thinking maybe they needed to move, but he didn't want to because they were so integrated into the community. On November 18th, 1987, Keith didn't show up for work. And as Keith was known as responsible and super hardworking, this was not like Keith. In fact, it was quite strange. So because Keith was such a reliable person, his colleagues were immediately worried, and they called the police to do a welfare check immediately because, who knows, are they okay? The police walked in, and inside they found a horrendous scene. In this scene, they found Elaine, they found Peter, the 3-year-old son, and they found the newborn child that had just been born, all tucked up in bed. But all of them had been killed. They were all hit around the head with a baseball bat, and it seemed that Elaine had given birth whilst she was being hit in the head. When they looked to try and find Keith, Keith was nowhere to be found, and his car, a 1981 Plymouth, was gone. So immediately police thought that Keith was the main suspect. This was so shocking to the community because Keith was known as being a wonderful father, a wonderful community member, and this just didn't add up. Now, because Keith was the main suspect, whilst they had to do a search party for him, the police searching for him were all armed, fully armed. And they went to his mother's house initially, searching through all of his mother's house and seeing if Keith had taken refuge there. But there was no luck. Keith was not found during this time. One day later, the police received a call. A few hunters had gone hunting at their local area and had started scouring the area, but then they stumbled across a body. Now, police arrived to the scene and were shocked. They were absolutely horrified by what they saw. Keith had been shot in the head 3 times and had the lower region removed, if you know what I mean. Keith's body was also posed in like a really weird ritual sacrifice kind of way. And it was just so bizarre. So the police, rightfully so, probably thought that this was a message, and they were like, I think someone's trying to send us a message, but we don't get it. Like, we don't get it at all. Like, text not received kind of thing. I think this person probably went a little bit too complex for them, but it was a very shocking and horrendous sight, and the police were already just disgusted. When they asked around town for everyone who knew them, everyone loved them. There was no motives, there was no one who would want to get vengeance, there was no arguments that they had with anyone. So with no significant leads, the case went cold. Now, there was one serial killer who tried to claim these murders, but he was a notorious liar and had made up several different stories, and also tried to claim several different murders that didn't add up. And his storytelling of this particular murder was inconsistent with the actual ongoings. Now, Tommy Lynn Sells was that serial killer, and I will not be covering him because he lied so much that it's actually really hard to talk about him. I don't think he realized that by lying to a certain extent, his infamy would never grow, even though that was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be famous. But leaving that in the past, the case is still cold to this day. So what are the theories? So the locals believe that perhaps it was a traveling serial killer. Now, the murders were so horrendous and so bad that they didn't believe that this could be the work of a normal person or like just a one-off kind of thing, because they were so heinous and they genuinely seemed like they had something particularly against Keith. It was just so bizarre. You've got to remember, this is the 1980s, so the second theory was a very common theory, and nearly every murder at some point got labeled with this title. So other people also thought it was Satanism. They thought that this seemed very ritualistic, and perhaps it was to worship Satan, which I think was a very common theory in 1980s about literally everything. And you've got to remember that when you're taking this theory in. Another theory, which I don't think holds up, was that perhaps there was a domestic dispute. So maybe Keith had cheated on someone, or Elaine had cheated on someone, and they had gone into a fight. Now, this doesn't quite make sense, because obviously Keith was found in a particular manner that wouldn't be able to be done to himself. So it was a very bizarre theory, and ultimately doesn't hold up. Now, with advances in DNA technology, the family and other people in the area have actually tried to get this case reopened, because whilst it's a cold case, the DNA advances that have happened, especially with genetic DNA advancements, could at least lead to some suspects that otherwise have never occurred. But I'm curious to know, what do you think? Be sure to comment down below. If you are enjoying my content, make sure you are giving a like and subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.